The goal of this video lecture is to review the characteristics of personality disorders in the DSM-5 and to review the 3 different clusters of personality disorders and discuss the key characteristics of the disorders that are classified in each of those clusters. When we're talking about personality disorders, conceptually we are thinking about an individual's personality, so their characteristic way of interacting with the world, and characterizing personalities that are maladaptive and cause problems for an individual. So in contrast to other disorders in the DSM, where the symptoms that a person is experiencing are assumed to be superimposed on their underlying personality and identity, when we conceptualize personality disorders, we're considering this to be more core to the individual. So their core personality traits, the characteristics that define them as a person, are maladaptive and are causing problems, either causing distress, leading to impairment in their interactions with others or other important elements of their lives, or may be dangerous or causing other kinds of problems. In previous editions of the DSM that used a multi-axial system, personality disorders were actually classified separately from other disorders, which were called Axis 1 disorders. So disorders such as depression, anxiety, or psychotic disorders were classified on Axis 1, and personality disorders and intellectual disabilities were classified on Axis 2. So this represented that they were considered conceptually distinct, that rather than being seen as disorders that an individual might experience that were added on top of that individual's core personality, that these we are conceptualizing as disorders of that personality itself. So in the DSM-5, we have gotten rid of that multi-axial system, but we still retain the definition of personality disorders that emphasizes that they are more stable and more core to the important components of an individual's characteristic personality. So in the DSM-5, personality disorders are defined as an enduring pattern of inner experiences and behavior that deviates markedly from the expectations of an individual's culture. So it's affecting both their subjective experiences, but also how they behave, and it's also inconsistent with typical patterns and expectations for that individual's social context. In addition, these personality patterns need to be manifested in at least 2 domains, so it's expressed in a wide range of ways that they experience the world. So it's manifested in terms of their cognition, how they think about the world, how they perceive the world. It's manifested in affective experiences, so the kinds of emotions that they tend to experience, perhaps their intensity of emotional experiences or their reactivity. It's also manifested in interpersonal functioning, so how they are able to interact with other people. And another important domain is impulse control, so their ability to control their behaviors. Importantly, personality disorders are pervasive and inflexible in a broad range of situations. So much as we consider personality to be a characteristic way of interacting with the world that's stable across time and across situations, symptoms of personality disorders are also pervasive and inflexible in a broad range of situations. So we're not just seeing these symptoms in a work context or when people are interacting with their families, but that we're seeing across a wide range of situations that the person's personality characteristics are maladaptive. In addition, just like personality, the symptoms of personality disorders are stable, of long duration, and can be traced back to adolescence or early adulthood. So these are problems that an individual is experiencing that are occurring over a long period of time and that are stable going back to that time period in which we tend to see personality be established. And then finally, these symptoms are causing distress or impairment. So for some disorders that are classified in this section, they are ego-dystonic and people find the symptoms to be distressing. But overall, the personality disorders tend to be more ego-syntonic. So often the symptoms are perceived by the individual to be very core to their personality. So they don't consider them symptoms, but they consider it an element of who they are. However, they may also experience the consequences of these personality traits to be distressing. For example, if it causes conflict or problems in their interpersonal functioning. The symptoms may also cause impairment, so they may prevent a person from being able to interact with others effectively or they may cause impairment in terms of posing a danger to the individual experiencing the symptoms, or they may be dangerous to other people interacting with that individual. So in the DSM-5, we continue to have a categorical classification system of the personality disorders. There was initially a proposal to move to a dimensional system for classifying the personality disorders that would be more similar to the 5-factor model that we use to characterize overall personality traits. But for now, we still have a categorical model for talking about personality disorders, where these disorders are organized into 3 different clusters, and each of these clusters contains different disorders that are characterized by different sets of symptoms. So our first set of disorders is cluster A. This is also called the odd eccentric cluster. So in cluster A, we see disorders that are characterized by symptoms similar to those that we observe in schizophrenia or the other psychotic disorders. For example, we might see inappropriate or flat affect, we might see odd patterns of cognition or behavior, and we might see kinds of beliefs like magical thinking or paranoia that are similar to delusional beliefs in psychotic disorders, but not as severe. So sometimes we talk about the odd eccentric personality disorders as existing on the schizophrenia spectrum, but not being severe enough to be classified as psychotic disorders because the individual symptoms are not severe enough to reflect true psychosis. The first disorder in the odd eccentric cluster is paranoid personality disorder. Paranoid personality disorder is characterized by chronic and pervasive mistrust of other people. So these are individuals who are very suspicious of other people. They are untrusting of other people's motives. They don't trust other people. And importantly, this chronic and pervasive mistrust is unwarranted and maladaptive. So it causes problems in their interpersonal relationships. So they may avoid relationships with other people because they don't trust them. They are suspicious of their motives. It may cause conflict in their interpersonal relationships. It may cause problems in their ability to interact with others, for example, in social settings or in work settings or in their families. So importantly, paranoid personality disorder is not characterized by fully delusional beliefs. It's more characterized by an overall pattern of interacting with the world where an individual really has trouble trusting other people and really doesn't feel secure about other people's motives. The next disorder in this cluster is called schizoid personality disorder. And the defining characteristic of schizoid personality disorder is a chronic lack of interest in interpersonal relationships that leads to avoidance of these interpersonal relationships. In terms of affective experience and expression, it also tends to be characterized by a very cold, unreactive affective experience. So these are people who tend not to experience a high level of emotion and who are not very emotionally reactive, particularly in interpersonal situations. It's important to distinguish schizoid personality disorder from other disorders that might be characterized by avoidance of interpersonal relationships. So for example, in social anxiety disorder, you might see an individual avoid interpersonal interactions, but in that case, it's not because they are not interested in interpersonal interactions, it's because they are anxious that they might be evaluated negatively. Schizoid personality disorder, in contrast, is characterized by a lack of interest in these interpersonal relationships. They're not found to be rewarding, so a person is not interested in forming these relationships. So a very typical example of schizoid personality disorder would be an individual who tends to have very few friendships through their adolescence and young adulthood. They don't develop close friendships or spend a lot of time with other people in interpersonal contexts. And after the death of their relatives, for example, if they don't have siblings after their parents die, they may not really have any close interpersonal relationships. And they don't express any desire to develop those interpersonal relationships. So they're not bothered by these lack of social contexts. The final disorder in this cluster we've already talked about. This is schizotypal personality disorder. Of the disorders in the odd eccentric cluster, this is the disorder that's most closely related to schizophrenia and the other psychotic disorders. So we often think of this as a less severe manifestation of the psychotic disorders, and perhaps indicative either that a person experienced some genetic contributions to psychotic disorders, but had fewer genetic contributions that resulted in them not displaying a full level of a psychotic disorder, Or it may be an individual who was at risk for a psychotic disorder. So, for example, perhaps they have a first-degree relative with a psychotic disorder and they have that genetic risk, but didn't experience stressors. So, for example, prenatal stressors or early life stressors that might have led to the development of a full psychotic disorder if we think about this from a diathesis stress perspective. So again, schizotypal personality disorder is characterized by symptoms that are similar to what we see in the psychotic disorders, but that are not fully psychotic. So it's a pervasive pattern of social and interpersonal deficits, cognitive and perceptual distortions, and odd or eccentric behavior that are unusual but not fully psychotic. So people may have unusual problems in their social relationships. They may interact in unusual ways or have particular difficulty with interpersonal relationships, but we may not see the same level of social withdrawal that we might see as a negative symptom in schizophrenia. They might have some cognitive abnormalities, so some unusual beliefs or some magical thinking that are not fully delusional. They may experience some unusual perceptual experiences that are not fully hallucinatory. So for example, they may kind of see shadows out of the corner of their eye, or they may think they hear their name being called frequently when they're not actually hearing anybody calling their name, but not to the extent that we would definitely be able to identify as a hallucination. And their behavior might be odd or unusual, but may not be disturbed enough that we would consider it to be disorganized behavior. So we're seeing a really pervasive pattern of problems that are consistent with the kinds of symptoms that we see in schizophrenia and the psychotic disorders, but that are not fully psychotic. And research supports that schizotypal personality disorder of these three disorders is the most closely related to the other psychotic disorders. So there's a much weaker relationship between paranoid personality and schizoid personality and the psychotic disorders. So for example, when we look at the family history of individuals with these disorders, you're much more likely to see individuals with schizophrenia in the families of people with schizotypal personality disorder compared to the families of individuals with paranoid or schizoid personality disorders. Our next cluster of personality disorders, cluster B, is also called the dramatic erratic cluster. So this is a cluster of disorders that are characterized by problematic interpersonal relationships that might be characterized as manipulative or volatile, also characterized by impulsive behavior, affective instability, or disregard of the rights of others. So we will talk further about antisocial personality disorder, but the key components of antisocial personality disorder are a pervasive pattern of criminal or callous behavior and disregard for the rights of others or social norms. So these are individuals who are consistently engaging in behavior that is harmful to other people, that disregards the rights of other people, and who are not displaying concern for violating legal or social norms. We're also going to talk further about borderline personality disorder. The key defining characteristic of borderline personality disorder is instability. So in borderline personality disorder, we see instability in affective experience. So individuals with borderline personality disorder tend to experience affective experiences at a high level of intensity and to be very emotionally reactive to different kinds of experiences. We also see unstable cognition, so they tend to go back and forth with very black and white thinking. So things are either wonderful or they are terrible. They love someone or they hate them. Something is great or it is awful. They also tend to have an unstable sense of identity, so their sense of self may shift very rapidly over time. They may not have a core sense that they have a stable identity. They may feel very empty. They may feel like they're defined by external characteristics, such as what their hobbies are or who they spend their time with. They also tend to have very unstable interpersonal relationships. So sometimes this is referred to as splitting, when an individual's interpersonal relationships go back and forth between being very highly idealized, so the person is perfect, the relationship is great, to being completely demonized, the person is terrible and the relationship is awful. So the most stable characteristic of borderline personality disorder is its instability, that across all of these various domains, individuals with borderline personality disorder are experiencing a very high level of instability and change. Our next disorder in the dramatic erratic cluster is called histrionic personality disorder. So histrionic is a word that is related to performance and drama. So individuals with histrionic personality disorder have very dramatic personalities. So in terms of their affective experiences, they have very intense and rapidly shifting moods, similar to what we see in borderline personality disorder. They tend to have unstable interpersonal relationships. But in contrast to borderline personality disorder, a really defining characteristic of histrionic personality disorder is a very intense need for attention and approval from other people that's accompanied by dramatic or seductive behavior. So for example, they may dress in a very attention-seeking way. Their interpersonal behavior may be very provocative. So when we think about histrionic personality disorder, a term that sometimes gets thrown out is a drama queen. This is an individual who is very performative and very expressive and has a very intense need for attention and approval from other people that influences their behavior to seek this approval and attention. And then our final disorder in cluster B is narcissistic personality disorder. So just as the name suggests, this is characterized by a very inflated sense of self and behavior that reflects this exaggerated sense of self and a lack of regard for other people. So a core characteristic of narcissistic personality disorder is grandiosity, so an overinflated sense of self. They think that they are really wonderful compared to other people. A lack of concern for others' needs, and in their interpersonal relationships, they tend to be exploitative and arrogant. So individuals with narcissistic personality disorder have a very high sense of self and a very low sense of others that leads them to act in ways that really benefit themselves at the expense and cost of other people. And then our final set of personality disorders, or cluster C, are also called the anxious fearful disorders. So these are disorders that are characterized by an over-concern with evaluation or criticism of others, fears of abandonment, problems in relationships related to this anxiety, and a high level of anxiety and negative affect. So one of the disorders in this cluster is very similar to another disorder that we've already discussed. So avoidant personality disorder is characterized by very pervasive anxiety, an overall sense of inadequacy, and an intense fear of criticism, which leads to avoidance of social interactions. This probably sounds a lot like social anxiety disorder or social phobia. And research suggests that avoidance personality disorder can be conceptualized as an extreme manifestation of social anxiety disorder. So when someone's anxiety about being negatively evaluated in social situations is very pervasive and is a key component of their personality, so when a core element of their affective experience is this chronic sense of anxiety and fear related to these social interactions, that when their cognitions are overwhelmingly characterized by this sense of inadequacy and fear of negative evaluations, when their behavior is very strongly influenced by this avoidance of social interactions, we might, in addition to a diagnosis of a social anxiety disorder, also consider giving a diagnosis of avoidant personality disorder. So it is a more severe and more pervasive manifestation of social anxiety disorder. A related disorder is dependent personality disorder. The defining characteristic of dependent personality disorder is an overwhelming sense of selflessness to the point that it is maladaptive and causes a person not to meet their own needs. So these are individuals who are so selfless and so concerned with pleasing others that they'll disregard and not meet their own needs. It's also characterized by a need to be cared for, so a sense of inadequacy of being able to make their own decisions, reliance and dependence on other people, and also submission to other people's interests and desires. So these are individuals who don't feel comfortable asserting their own needs and will subsume their own needs to the desires and wishes of other people, but who also don't feel able to or competent to take care of themselves and make their own decisions and will rely very heavily on other people to take care of them. Our final disorder in this cluster is obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. The name of this disorder can be deceptive because even though it sounds a lot like obsessive-compulsive disorder, it's not actually very similar. So obsessive compulsive disorder tends to be ego dystonic. It's characterized by those intrusive obsessive thoughts and ego dystonic compulsive behaviors. In contrast, obsessive compulsive personality disorder tends to be very ego syntonic. The defining characteristic of OCPD is pervasive rigidity in behaviors and in interpersonal relationships. In addition, in terms of their affective experience, they tend to be very emotionally constricted, so they don't experience a lot of emotions. They're not very emotionally reactive. They tend to be highly perfectionistic and rigid. And when their routine is disrupted, they experience a high level of anxiety. So the rigidity of their behavior and the anxiety that they experience can look behaviorally similar to what someone with OCD experiences with their compulsions. But in contrast to OCD, where their compulsive behaviors are perceived to be ego dystonic and irrational, in obsessive compulsive personality disorder, this rigidity is perceived to be ego syntonic. So the person has a right way of doing things. They have a rigid way of approaching things that they believe is correct, and they want to approach the world in that way. And they're not distressed by the rigidity. They are mostly distressed when other people interfere with their correct way of interacting with the world. So I had one supervisor when I was working in a clinic who used to describe the difference between OCD and OCPD. He would say, if you have an individual in their kitchen, someone with OCD might say, yes, I have to have all of the cans lined up so that the labels are facing out and in order. And I wish that I didn't have to do this, and it is taking up a lot of time, and it would be great if I could just come home from the grocery store and put the groceries away. In contrast, someone with obsessive compulsive personality disorder says, well, this is the right way to put the groceries away, and I'm going to put them away this way, and if you don't put them away in the kitchen in this way, you are wrong, and also you're an idiot. And then they will not let you do the grocery shopping, and they will put the cans away, and they'll also be rude to you in their interactions because you have interfered with their rigidity and their approach. So individuals with OCPD also tend to have a lot of trouble delegating things to other people. As you can imagine, this tends to cause difficulties in their interpersonal relationships. So to sum up, our personality disorders are enduring patterns of personality. So they're experiences and behavior that deviate markedly from social or cultural expectations. They're manifested in at least two domains, so they're affecting a wide range of a person's experiences, including cognition, emotion, interpersonal relationships and impulse control. It's pervasive across different situations. It's inflexible. It's stable across time, so we see it over a long duration and can be traced back to at least early adolescence, and it leads to distress or impairment. Overall in the population, we see prevalence rates of about 10 to 13% for any personality disorder across the lifetime. Thinking about our cluster A personality disorders, so that odd eccentric cluster, we see prevalence of about 6% in the population. For our cluster B personality disorders, that dramatic erratic cluster, we see a much lower prevalence, about 2% in the population. And our cluster C personality disorders, those anxious fearful disorders, we're seeing prevalence of about 6% in the population.